One of the things that shocks me is how uninformed the American people seem to be on just how pervasive the attacks against this nation are in cyberspace. You know, the Assault and Volt Typhoon being an example. I think I was speaking at CrowdStrike or some place. It was in D.C. when I said this, when I first coined this phrase. But having that intrusion into our cell phone systems, our telecoms. Imagine if Russia placed a satchel charge next to a cell tower and had a detonator in their hand. We'd be livid. But essentially, that's exactly what China has done to our telecommunications systems, right, Mr. Cable? I mean, you brought it up very well in your testimony. And yet, there's no clamor about this on the television. There's no, alerts or reels. They literally have a kill switch in the system right now. And nobody's making a big deal out of it. Why do you guys think that's the case? And I'll throw that out to any one of you who wants to answer.
I'll just say, first of all, I think because we haven't really taken this to the American people to explain the gravity of it. And I think to really ask the question, okay, well, why? Why is China on our systems? And Mr. Cable really, I think, alluded to it, is because I think they're preparing for war. Yeah. The Chinese Communist Party is preparing for war in a number of ways, right? We see it with their massive buildup of their military forces, about a 44-fold increase in their defense spending since the year 2000. We see it in the development of weapon systems to sort of keep us at bay. But also, I think what we can do is connect what we've seen with Volt Typhoon to a broader range of threats, including the massive buildup of their nuclear forces, about a 400% increase. I know it may seem extreme to say this, but I believe that China is developing a first strike nuclear capability against us. Because why else would you want to cripple all of your critical infrastructure, including communications infrastructure? And if you look at the pattern of their intelligence collection, for example, the balloon intelligence collection was really aimed at communications intelligence that could only be picked up at that altitude, and that was communications intelligence associated with our strategic forces. So I think the American people haven't really had this explained in context, and maybe we need something like, the old movie The Day After, that shows what it would look like. Something like what was done with the Social Dilemma movie, to kind of bring it home to people. But that's something, Chairman Green, I think we can take on here at the Hoover Institution, is to sort of package, an understanding of this threat and communicate that as effectively as we can.
Yeah, I think that's something that's part of the reason why we're here, not only to get the information from you guys, but to be on TV so the American people can hear from you guys. Deterrence, I've always thought of deterrence as the product, not the sum of capability and will. You have all the capability in the world and zero will, you get zero deterrence. 0 times infinity is still 0. So if you guys could make some comments about what you think we need to do better in terms of capability and then in terms of will. I know that's a broad topic, but I'm thinking about really how do we establish deterrence in the cyberspace? And maybe Ms. Whitmore, you can take a shot at that.
Absolutely. And Chairman Green, I think further to your earlier question, as well as the General's commentary here, my viewpoint on this has been from 20 years of responding on the ground to some of the most major breaches that have occurred in the last 2 decades. And, many of those when I started my career in the military were highly classified investigations that no one talked about and certainly couldn't be talked about in open dialogue. And so that certainly contributed to the lack of awareness from the public. I think it is a great movement in the right direction that we now can have such an open dialogue. But the reality is, in addition to the lack of awareness, I think one of the things that we unfortunately do today is punish the victims. So what I mean by that is when we, for example, a bank robbery, we oftentimes don't publish that on the news and blame the bank for, having an armed robber come in at gunpoint and a teller provide them some funds that are in their tray. But when the media gets hold of cases of cybercrime and these massive intrusions, we do often do that. And then we add regulation in that requires them to provide information in this most dynamic time period, the first 48 to 72 hours, very similar to traditional crimes. That's also the time that it's most dynamic in a computer intrusion. So you have a victim who is now potentially trying to negotiate or have communications with an attacker. They're working with law enforcement. They're working with outside legal counsel, and they still don't have all the technical details of an investigation that are needed to fully answer these questions and understand, is this a national security issue? Is this potentially a cyber criminal that's could potentially be related to a terrorist or criminal organization? So I think that as we're talking through solutions here, there are a lot of technical recommendations, which certainly Palo Alto Networks would provide, about greater capabilities in the hands of the victims so that they can get answers quickly. But there's also the component of it of what can we do from a government lens of making sure that we're providing as much support possible to the victims so that we don't expect a small to medium business to effectively, to use your terminology, go up against some of the greatest military capability that our foreign adversaries have to offer.
Yeah, I'm going to go from the 100,000 foot down to, like, Mr. Cable, you talked about secure by design. This is more at the tactical level. And your company, if I understand it correctly, is out there trying to help other developers develop their products secure from the beginning. The whole point of the reversing of the economic model. One of the questions I ask is, I'm a physician. I ran a healthcare company. If I developed a medical device that looked really great, we put it in 200,000 people, and then it turns out to be faulty, and it harms those individuals, I'm done. I've lost everything, and my company's going to pay a big price, probably go out of business. Why is it that a software company that can put an app out there that has a vulnerability in it, no big deal? How is that fair? Can you explain something?
Thank you, Chairman, for the question. To your point, that this isn't fair, and to build on what Ms. Whitmore was saying, this is not a fair fight. If we look to the small businesses, the hospitals, the school systems who have been facing these attacks, whether they're ransomware attacks, whether they're state-sponsored actors, this is not a fair fight. We cannot rely on these under-resourced organizations to be able to defend against sophisticated cyber criminals and nation-state threats. Really, we need to your point, take a step back and look at the security of the technology that is underpinning our critical infrastructure. The fact is that today, in many ways, we are leaving our doors open to our nation's adversaries. They are able to compromise our critical infrastructure through relatively simple, preventable vulnerabilities in software products, and the software companies are not incentivized or held responsible for these vulnerabilities. At CISA, we worked to advocate for software companies to both voluntarily increase their security through the Secure by Design pledge, with both Google and Palo Alto Networks, for instance, are signatories of. We worked to make sure that companies were really pushing to the cutting edge and taking actions like reducing entire classes of vulnerabilities from their products. I am generally optimistic that we can root out these vulnerabilities from our software products, but this is going to take time, and it's really going to take shifting incentives. So there's, I think, good room to be had for discussions around what I mentioned with secure by demand, getting private companies, getting the government to start to demand better security practices from software suppliers. But I do also think we need to consider a software liability regime by which manufacturers of software products are held accountable for preventable vulnerabilities in those products. And of course, that we give sufficient safe harbor protections to ensure that there's a bar that software manufacturers can meet.
Well, I appreciate your answer on that, because it's a tough one. I talked to some of the biggest companies in the world that makes both hardware, software, operating systems, the whole gamut. And nobody wants to they don't want product liability, So, being a military, I'm going to ask one more question, then I'll turn it over to you. We had a military guy, I think courses of action, right? And then 3 military folks and a guy who worked in the government. So you probably have heard that term before, courses of action. What are the courses of action? So you look at a ransomware attack, for example. If we're going to come up with solutions to how do we stop this stuff, we have to have courses of action. On the extreme, one I've heard, which on the surface sounds sort of anti-Republican, anti-private sector, but on some level makes some sense to me, is just outlaw the payment of a ransomware. A couple people get hit at the beginning. There's some cost of those entities because their systems are, maybe we have a fund that can help cover that. But at some point, the bad guys aren't going to get paid. They know they're not going to get paid, and that would be ultimate deterrence for ransomware. What are your thoughts, Ms. Manfra?
I do not think it would be effective to outlaw the payment, but I wanted to go to your point on deterrence.
Not to, let me make sure I got this. Not to outlaw ransomware.
Payments. You can outlaw
I'm
ransomware.
saying outlaw payments of ransomware. Because you can outlaw drugs and they're everywhere, right? They're ubiquitous. But I mean to outlaw the payments.
The payments. Yeah. We should look at and discuss it some more, for sure. But I think it's just such a complicated space right now, and you run into scenarios where you potentially have life and safety issues without that payment. So there's lots of things that you would want to take into consideration.
Sure.
It's worth considering continuing that conversation though. On the higher level, when you talk about deterrence, and it's something that I've thought about a lot, and we've thought about as a company too, is I think that there's a couple of different elements of thinking about deterrence, and oftentimes they get conflated when we're talking about cybersecurity. And when you're thinking about, and people say deterrence by denial, right? Make our defense excellent so they can't get through. And that is a real thing that we need to continue to invest in. But then you also talked about capability and will for not just that deterrence by denial, denying their ability to get into systems, but denying an ability to take the actions that they are seeking to. But I would say there's also thinking about and much more clear-eyed the risks that our country faces. So we need that stable baseline. We need to raise the level of security all over. Attackers are still taking advantage of very easily known vulnerabilities that should be fixed. And I agree that both software vendors and others in the community, there needs to be some accountability mechanisms in place to ensure that we're delivering secure and safe software. And then of course accountability in place to make sure that people are using it correctly. And so I would say there's one effort that needs to be focused on how do we stop the continued poor performance in known security issues. But then there's another effort, which the JCDC played some part in this, and I think and CISA can continue to lean in here, is there are unique national risks that impact certain sectors more than others, and require a different set of capabilities and perhaps a smaller set of actors that have capabilities in the private sector and the government coming together to identify what is the threat, how are we going to counter that threat, who has the capabilities to do that in a collective way. And that requires a new type of public-private partnership that is just as important as raising that baseline and making sure every small business has what they need. But we also need to be focused very much on reducing the consequences of the next time we find China or some other actor in these critical systems. And we need to be opening up that dialogue and that operational collaboration between the companies and the entities in the government to do much more work in reducing those national risks for those foreign actors who would hold our country at risk.
Yeah, I'm going to make a quick comment, and then I'm going to let Mr. Garbarino have a couple of minutes. You said something there that was very interesting to me. Next time we find China in the system, so to speak, and this is something that's been my staff will tell you they've been hearing me say this for years. It is unfair for the federal government to expect the private sector to defend itself against a nation state. We, particularly my side of the aisle, has pushed very hard about a sovereign border, having a sovereign border that needs to be protected and that the government has a responsibility to protect. And you know, if China were physically driving tanks across the southern border, that's exactly what the federal government would do, would be to defend against that. But I would submit that there is a cyber border that's just as sovereign, and we can't expect companies to defend themselves. And I think it's going to take a paradigm shift, because for decades we've taken this free market approach that private sector takes care of itself, government takes care of itself. And again, I think that's self-defeating, because the networks are so connected now. Wherever a person enters, they can pretty much move laterally anywhere in the networks. The government shares cloud space with companies at Amazon. So I just want to say that I couldn't agree with you more. I think, and I want to reiterate this to whomever's paying attention, the federal government has a responsibility, and we need to step up and partner and do it more and better.